They pinned the card on my dress, like it was the punchline to a joke I hadn't been invited to. It lay on my chest, white with a faint blue border, the calligraphy soft and careful. For a moment, I thought I'd misread it. Then the words sharpened in my head. The old lady who will pay for everything. I remember the exact way the sunlight fell through the ballroom windows that afternoon, the kind of late spring light that makes florals look like they glow from within. I remember Jennifer's veil, a cloud around her shoulders, and Mark laughing at something someone in the bridal party had said. I remember the gentle rustle of guests moving between tables and my hand, the one that used to hold Robert's, without even thinking, frozen on the edge of my chair. My face went warm. Not in the way it does when you dance with a grandson at a school recital, no. This was heat that crawled up from embarrassment and settled heavy behind my eyes. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to pull the pin off and pretend I didn't see. I wanted anyone to say, "Oh, that was meant as a joke," and for them to mean it. Instead, there were looks that didn't meet mine, and one too loud chuckle from across the table. Pamela made that face she makes when something amuses her and she hopes you know not to be offended. Richard caught my eye and looked away. I folded the card into my palm so the words were hidden. I could feel the crease of the paper bite into my skin, sharp enough to be a small, private insult. At the top of the evening, I had thought weddings were safe. They are public celebrations of love and families binding together. Robert and I had gone to hundreds in the years we were healthy together, friends, children, cousins, colleagues. We stood at the back, sometimes together. Sometimes he would give me that look and ask for my hand to steady himself, and I'd remember the smell of his aftershave anise and cedar, and I'd feel, briefly, the whole world right. That perfume came back now, like a ghost pulling at the seam of a memory. A Tuesday in a small kitchen after a storm. When Robert had come home early from work and made tea and spoken of that son's wedding when Jennifer was small, of the way family should be. His hand had been on my wrist, then the way a good map steadies a traveler. He believed in generosity, the way some people believe in prayer. He taught me that helping family was part of keeping a family. Which is why my hands trembled as I unbuttoned the card and smoothed it against my palm. Because I loved him, I had done what he would have asked. Because I trusted Richard when he said he needed a little help, I wrote the checks. Because grief makes hands too full to hold distrust, I said yes when Pamela texted and begged. And when the numbers on the back of envelopes grew and the balance of my life tilted toward other people's wants, I never thought it would end with a name tag. If you're watching this, and you're in the same city as me, tell me where you are. I always like seeing where people are listening from. The first time Richard asked for a large favor, it landed like any other family request, urgent, heavily wrapped in affection. He called on a Tuesday and said he and Pamela were ready to take a step, to buy a place for the boys. The market was moving, and they'd found a little house, if someone could help with the down payment. I remember the exact amount he mentioned because it floated ahead of everything else, like a small boat, $30,000. $30,000 is a life, if you've done everything by the book, and think your later years will be comfortable. To me, it was a lifeline to them, a way to keep the family together under one roof. To give the grandsons a backyard, to have somewhere for Thanksgiving that smelled like turkey and not takeout. It seemed like a good investment in family, in seeing my grandchildren grow up, with the kind of stability Robert had always wanted for them. So I cashed out a CD we'd tucked away and wrote the check. I sealed it in an envelope with a note that said, simply, for the kids. I signed with my full name, the one Robert liked to use when he was being formal. And I felt, for a time, the warmth of doing right. The next ask came in the steady drip of life. The boys needed a camp, fee covered. Pamela's car broke down. Richard wanted to host a rehearsal dinner at a lovely venue downtown and called to say the only way to secure the date was a deposit. That one was $45,000. I remember the roundness of that number because I put it in the ledger book. Robert kept where we recorded small payments, charity, and the occasional splurge, and the ink smudged a little as my hands shook. I could tell you, and I have told friends, that the money was never about the numbers. It's always easier to blame a sum than to accept a collection of reasons: grief, a desire to keep the peace, the comfort of being needed. On paper, $30,000 here, $45,000 there, looks like kindness. In practice, over 3 years, it added up to a pattern: calls at odd hours, texts that never began with "How are you?" but always ended with a plea, assumptions that my purse opened when life asked. By the time I realized, the total hovered near $250,000. It felt less like a series of favors and more like a ledger of my eroding privacy, checks cashed on my account, invoices paid by my credit card, small loans repaid with the kind of informal language one uses when you're trusting someone to give back. There were no dramatic bank runs, no forged signatures. There was just a very steady funnel of my savings into their plans. It wasn't all them, not entirely. I gave because of Robert. I gave because I loved the boys and wanted them comfortable. I gave because it felt like the last thing I could do to keep the echo of our family intact. But generosity must have boundaries. And I didn't know where to draw mine until someone drew it for me with blue ink. A pin, a joke. After the dinner, I sat by myself on a narrow balcony facing the hotel gardens until the moon rose and washed the hedges in silver. Michael came out after me. He stood behind me, close enough that I could hear the rustle of his suit, and he didn't ask why I was alone. He just offered me a glass of water and a look that felt like the sort of look Robert used to give when he wanted to say both "I understand" and "we must be careful." He didn't mean it, he said quietly, nodding toward where Richard laughed with a group at the foot of the stairs. The card. He didn't mean it to be. Of course he didn't, I said, though I did not mean it. Michael is the kind of grandson who keeps his thoughts to himself until you ask in the right way. He had my patience. He watched people the way some watch the weather, noticing the small changes before a storm. He is kind, and he is loyal in that quiet way that does not demand gratitude. I have always loved him for that. That night, gripping the balcony railing, I let the name tag curl up in my palm. It was absurd and stinging, and exactly the sort of thing I used to laugh about when Robert made jokes at my expense. The difference was he would have side-eyed the room, told them the joke wasn't funny, and then made a point of saying something generous about me, my laugh, my stubbornness in the garden, the way I always remembered birthdays. No one did that for me now. A week later, at the rehearsal dinner, the atmosphere had a brittle edge. That card had landed in the air like spilled salt. People were more careful with their jokes, but the air still carried an undercurrent of something I couldn't name. Richard's phone buzzed at the table. He checked it, smiled, and held it up. "Guess what?" he said, louder than necessary. "Jennifer and Mark will be going to Bali for their honeymoon. Don't worry, my mother has already offered." It was said like a benediction. The table laughed, patrons of a wealth they didn't need to declare. Pamela squeezed Richard's hand in approval. I felt the glass in my throat. I set my fork down so quietly no one noticed, and when the laughter ebbed, I looked at the face of the woman across from me, a friend who had known me since junior high, and I saw in her eyes that small, sympathetic dullness people get when to help some lightly shilindi. "Alice," "You're so generous," she whispered. "Are you sure you don't mind?" I didn't answer loud. I didn't want to be the ruined note at the end of a symphony. Instead, I put my napkin over the bowl of soup like an apology. "Of course not," I said, and meant it. Then, later that night, in the quiet of my small borrowed room, I took the napkin in my hands and stared at it until it seemed to take on its own shape. Those nights when the house is quiet, grief sharp and honest. You can hear things the rest of the world muffles, the creak of a wooden floorboard, the distant hum of a refrigerator, the memory of a man's voice answering the telephone. I started going through old boxes' photo albums, cards Robert had tucked in drawers, the ledger where our lives had been kept in ink. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was looking for a way to remind myself I hadn't always been on the receiving end of small, ugly jokes. I found a stack of canceled checks folded in the back of a recipe box. They were not hidden in a malicious way. Robert always liked his papers organized. He liked to have receipts in order, bills laid out in easy rows. The checks were folded and labeled. House, camp, wedding, each had my name on it in the bank stamp. Each had the words we used: loan, gift, help. There were dates, in Robert's neat hand, and an occasional phone number scribbled in the margin. When I lined the checks up, on the kitchen table I felt the weight of them. There was that $30,000 check. There was the deposit for the venue, $45,000. There were smaller amounts. A string that altogether rounded close to a figure I could scarcely think about without letting out a small, involuntary sound. Michael noticed the way I stared at the numbers. He sat down across from me and picked up a check, turning the thin paper between his fingers as if it were a fragile leaf. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but not completely. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after you realize you've been used without malice. It's not dramatic, it's the sound of the water leaving a bathtub. No one pulled a plug. The flow just slowed until nothing was left. I told myself I would handle it with the conversation. I would call Richard and ask for clarity. I would say no, firmly, next time, but life is not a list of good intentions. Calls came and went. When I tried to ask for my privacy, I was met with the kind of gentle offense reserved for family. "How can you be asking this now? We're in the middle of so much. We all make sacrifices. Besides, we love you." That word love became a sort of armor for their demands. If you can call your insistence love, then who can accuse you of unkindness? The real escalation happened, not with a spectacle, but with a brunch. Jennifer's mother-in-law had organized a Sunday gathering at a hotel brunch for all the relatives who had traveled in. I had refused a couple of invitations these months before, preferring quiet mornings at home and long walks in the park with Robert's old hat tucked under my arm. But that Sunday the weather was the kind of brilliant cold that makes you feel like the world has been washed. I thought a light meal among family would be a kindness to Jennifer and would be easy. I did not anticipate how the conversation would turn, how assumptions settle so easily into plans. Richard stood up in the middle of the room loud, well-meaning and loud, and announced, for the assembled family, that the honeymoon had been settled. He looked at me with the sort of paternal smile you give to someone who forgot to congratulate the family. "Isn't that great? Mom's already covered it. Bali, 2 weeks. First-class flights." Eyes turned to me like a tide creeping in. I could feel my face heat. My napkin, my secret ledger, all seemed ridiculous in the warmth of the chandelier. If I had wanted to keep the peace, that was the moment to smile and say, "That's the best gift," and to let myself be folded into gratitude. But something in me had been changing the last few months, slow as a seed cracking. Maybe it was the way grief had corroded the assumptions I used to hold. Maybe it was Michael's steady presence and that stack of cancelled checks. "Richard," I said, and the room went quiet in that useful, awful way. I did not raise my voice. I simply saw it. I didn't agree to that. There was a beat of breath. Laughter fluttered, as if someone forgot what had been said. Pamela's mouth made a small "oh." "Alice," she said, patronizing in the softest possible tone. "Svini. It means so much to them." I thought of the name tag on my dress. I thought of the way their voices avoided the thing I had been most afraid to own. That my money had become the family's fallback, my savings a line item used when someone wanted something now. I felt strangely honored and injured at the same time. Both feelings are possible. You can be loved and used in the same breath. After brunch, I went home with the television on in the empty house, because silence is its own grief. Michael called that evening and said he wanted to talk. He came over with Emma, his steady girlfriend, and sat with me at the kitchen table that had been Robert's for 30 years. They were careful around me in a way Pamela and Richard hadn't been. It felt like warmth with a lid over it. "There's been talk," Michael said, not looking at me directly. He was fingering the edge of a paper napkin like it might contain the secret. "About the house." "About what?" I asked. "Downsizing, moving you to an apartment, something smaller, easier to manage." He rubbed his thumb against the napkin. "They think it would be better for you." For a moment, I wanted to be fiercely indignant, to make a scene and call them all out. Instead, I felt an offhand, sort of cold settle in the pit of my stomach. "Did you hear them say they'd actually do it? Or are they thinking aloud?" Michael looked at me, and then away. "It's my Pamela Levchich. She said this is how she put it. We're being practical. It's what would be best for her. They talked about timing. They discussed listings. They assumed I'd be fine with it. They assumed you'd agree." Assumed. The word bumped against me with the same dullness as a brick. Assumptions are easy to make when you think someone else will clean up the consequences. They are a kind of invisible permission. "Did Robert ever talk about this?" I asked, not sure how to say the question out loud. Robert had always been my partner in any eventuality. We had talked about wills, about medical directives, about where the family pictures would go. I had trusted that he would have my back if anything ever happened to him. "Not directly," Michael said. "But he did tell me once, before." He stopped, then smiled in a small, apologetic way. "He said you were stubborn, that you were his stubbornness manifesto. He said, Alice will be fine. She knows what to do." I let the sentence settle. Stubbornness can be its own compass. It can also be its own crime. I thought about the name card again, about the laughter. I thought about how Robert had always managed the legal papers, how he had the habit of leaving the important things tucked into envelopes for safekeeping. He trusted people the way some trust the weather, expectable, not to be feared. It had made our life easy. It had made some things easy for others, too. That night, Michael stayed with me to help with a box of Robert's papers he had dug out from the hall closet. He sorted while I made tea. He had a calm about him that steadied a person like a hand on the back of your neck when stairs are steep. "When did they start assuming?" he asked, more a reflection than a question. I lit a cigarette. I don't smoke. Robert used it to sometimes, when he wanted to indulge melancholy and watched the smoke curl. "Not overnight," I said. "It's like a slow leak in the roof. You don't notice until the ceiling is stained." We went through envelopes. There were letters from charities, receipts from medical visits, coupons clipped from recipe pages. And then, tucked in an envelope marked Legal R, in Robert's handwriting, was a last letter, sealed in a way that made me think of envelopes in old movies' thick paper, a kind of weight to it. I didn't open it that night. I put it in my purse and told myself I'd do it in the morning. Instead, I found myself calling Martin Reynolds. Martin had been Robert's attorney for nearly 15 years. He had the kind of voice that made you feel like everything was under control, measured, with a sound of leather-bound books behind it. We had seen him at church functions once, and he had a kindness not of emotion but of competence. I had not known him well. I had only known that his name appeared on the blue legal folder, where Robert kept his funeral instructions. "Mrs. Holley," Martin said when he answered, as if he had been expecting the call. "How are you holding up?" "I'm trying," I said. Then, before I could soften it, I said, "Martin, can I come by? I have some papers Robert kept. I think there are things I should know. There are small mercies in the world. People who answer you when you are halfway desperate, with an intuitive understanding of what come by will mean." He offered me an appointment the next afternoon. "We'll go through anything you want," he said. "Bring the envelopes. Take the metered street. There's usually parking." At the wedding, the name tag had made my throat close. At the rehearsal dinner, a joke had felt like a brick. But the thing I most vowed not to do was make spectacle from my pain. I would not, I told myself, be the aunt who raises her voice and makes family gatherings miserable. There is a line between asserting yourself and creating scenes you will later regret. While fury is warm and immediate, quiet planning has its own heat, deeper, longer burning. So when I hung up with Martin, I didn't dial Richard. I didn't hurl accusations into the air like confetti. I made tea. I took out the envelope from Robert's folder and held it between two fingers. I turned it, felt the faint roughness of the seal. I told myself, in that small kitchen with the clock ticking, that I would meet with Martin as a courtesy. That I would ask questions and let him explain things. That I would, perhaps, find reasons I misunderstood. I also told myself, in a quieter voice, I wouldn't be the person I had been the last 3 years, always available, always on the end of a phone call. That I would try to decide for myself what generosity looked like now, rather than letting it be defined by others. The next morning I dressed without thinking of anyone else. I chose a navy cardigan Robert used to like, and the blue brooch he had given me on our 20th anniversary. Small rebellions make you feel dignified again. I put the envelope in my purse and walked the 2 blocks to Martin's office with a kind of collectedness I didn't feel. The city smelled of fresh rain. People moved in little clusters, brallas bobbing. I found a bench across from the law office and sat. I could feel the ledger book like a second heart under my arm, the place where numbers kept the pulse of our life. I found myself rehearsing what I would say, and the rehearsals all boiled down to one simple thing. I wanted to know the truth. I was careful, then, not to storm into battle. There would be time, perhaps, for confrontation. For now, I wanted the facts. I wanted to know whether their assumption that my money was a communal pot had any legal basis. I wanted to know if Robert had written anything specific, anything to protect me, or anything that might complicate the path. When Martin's assistant called my name, I stood and smoothed my cardigan. There are moments when life compresses into a doorway. You walk through the threshold and something decides to shift. I took a breath and entered his office. The leather chairs smelled old books and ink. The blinds made a lined shadow across the desk. Martin looked up, offered me that steady expression, and reached for the envelope. "Mrs. Holley," he said, without preface. "Before we begin, I should tell you something Robert asked me to place in his file. It's a clause of sorts, something he wanted me to keep, until an appropriate moment." My mouth went dry. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, and the air between us felt full of the sort of silence that stores small, important things. He steepled his fingers, and when he spoke his voice was low, careful. "It's a provision. A clause that if certain behaviors occurred, public humiliation or forcible attempts to control you, would have consequences for any descendants who participated." I felt the breath go out of me in a way that left the room larger and emptier at once. My stomach folded into a small, serious knot. "Consequences," I repeated. "Disinheritance, potentially," he said. He managed his words like a man walking across thin ice. "Robert wanted to protect you in certain situations. He anticipated that sometimes families become conflicted over money and care. He asked me to draft language that would discourage certain uses of your resources to the detriment of your autonomy." He said the words with care, and I heard in them both the shape of justice and something else, a reminder of the man who had loved me enough to think of such things. The envelope in my purse felt suddenly heavier, as if the paper had taken on the weight of a decision. I had walked into the office, wanting simple facts. What I did not want was spectacle. I did not want to stand at a microphone and declare the family's sins. I wanted to understand what Robert had done and why, and then to decide how to proceed without losing myself in fury. Martin slid a thin folder across the desk. It was legalese at first, glance clauses and conditions in small type. He asked if I wanted him to read it aloud. I thought of the name tag on my chest, the way the room chilled when Richard joked. I thought of the stack of cancelled checks on my kitchen table and the way Michael watched me in that half-sorrowful, half-resolute way he always had. "Read it to me," I said. "Please." He began to read, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, his voice carried a steadiness that felt like the man standing in the doorway of our life, the man who had tucked his arm into mine and said, "We'll do this together." I listened, and as the words of the clause filled the room, I felt something settle in me, a measure of relief that someone else had seen the shape of the danger and thought to shield me, and a prickling anger that it had come to this. When he finished, I folded my hands in my lap. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. But I didn't yet know what to do with this knowledge. I could use it as a shield. I could wave it and make them pay for their insolence. Or I could keep it like a small, secret weapon while I learned to stand on my own 2 feet again. Outside, the city moved on. Inside, in Martin's office, a plan was not yet formed. I had the facts. I had the taste of something like vindication on the back of the news. But I also had this small, stubborn intention. I would not be reduced to a punchline. I would not let my life be defined by the ease with which others could withdraw from their obligations and float jokes like corks above my head. Martin asked if I wanted copies of the documents. I nodded. He said he would catalog everything and hold the originals in trust. He looked at me then, searching perhaps for the reaction he could expect. "You don't have to decide anything today," he said. This was his wish. "How you choose to enforce it, if at all, is yours." I thanked him and left the office with the folder tucked under my arm and the envelope that held Robert's last notes pressed against it like a secret companion. The day was gray when I stepped back onto the sidewalk. I thought of the wedding card and how small acts can mean so much. I thought of the ledger and the way giving without boundaries can be gentle as a tide and hard as a current. On my way home, I saw Stub in the park and sat on a bench by the pond where the ducks used to gather. I unbuttoned the envelope and took out a letter in Robert's handwriting. It said few things, brief notes like the ones he always left recipes. Reminders to call the plumber, lists of people we owed dances with at fairs. Then, at the bottom, a short line in a hand I knew as well as the curve of my own name. It said, simply, protect Alice if you must. Not with force. With a hand, if they will accept it. I folded the paper and tucked it back carefully. Robert had not wanted a gong or a spectacle. He'd wanted a shield, something to be held up, if needed to defend my dignity. He'd expected the world to be gentler than it had turned out to be. He had been right and wrong in equal measures, the way people who love well often are. I sat there until the light shifted and the pond became a sheet of pewter. I had the documents in my bag. I had the list of numbers. I had a man named Martin who said the words conditional disinheritance without embellishment. Most of all, I had the decision to make. When I got home, the house was the same as I'd left it, quiet, full of little endings. I made tea and filled the kettle, and as the steam curled up I thought of the name tag on my dress and the way I had felt when I read the words. I thought of being the woman who had always given and how giving had been a way of being close to Robert, to his memory, to the idea of keeping family together. But I was not going to be the woman who gave until she had nothing left and then was laughed at with a bit of lacquered politeness. There is a line between generosity and erasure, and I had been walking it for a while, blind to the slow erosion. That night I called Michael and asked for tea and company. He arrived, and we put the folder on the counter. He sat, with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped, assessing the papers with the same careful, practical mind he used when planning a budget for the bookstore. Emma came shortly after, carrying a small loaf she'd baked. The three of us ate and looked at the sun falling through the window in stripes. "We can protect you," Michael said without ceremony. "You're not alone in this." I looked at him, and for the first time in months, I let myself imagine a next season. Not revenge. Not dramatic courtroom battles. Just a reweaving of a life that had frayed at the edges. Robert had given me a small instrument. I would decide how to use it. I didn't want to be cruel. I didn't want to be triumphant. I wanted, if possible, to be sensible. If Martin had given me a choice, I intended to use it as precisely as he had suggested, to discourage behavior meant to control or humiliate me, to make people consider their actions, to keep my dignity intact and, perhaps, to open a space for authentic reconciliation. There were practicalities to consider. Not yet how to enforce anything, not yet what letters I would write or calls I would make. For now, I wanted to prepare myself emotionally, financially, practically to not be taken for granted. I would stop answering at all hours. I would set a new rhythm to my days. I would say no out loud and not apologize. I would spend time with Michael and Emma. I would teach illiterate grandchildren how to read, or sit in a sunlit corner and paint their faces if they asked. It was in that small, steady way that resolve begins, not with a proclamation but with changes you could live with. I took out a blank notebook and wrote down small things: call friends back, take a painting class, schedule a health check, visit the bookstore more. Little acts that are the architecture of a life rebuilt. I closed the notebook and felt the future compress into that paper. Outside, neighbors' voices drifted by. Inside, I turned the page to a blank new line. I was not ready to make the clause public. I did not want to brand my family in front of friends and relatives. I wanted to move, quietly and deliberately, toward a life in which my choices mattered again. I wanted to find, if possible, a way for my grandchildren to understand that love does not mean entitlement. I wanted to teach, through example. When night came and Michael left to walk home, I stood at the kitchen window and looked down the street. The city was softer at that hour, its hard edges blunted. I touched the brooch at my throat and thought of Robert's hand on my wrist, of his voice saying that love is a practice, not a pronouncement. I had not yet decided whether I would enforce what was in the file. I had not yet told anyone to back off. I had sat in Martin's office and heard the phrase that made my blood both quicken and slow, but I was awake now, in a way I had not been. The laugh that had been meant to wound had softened into a reason to rethink everything. I placed Robert's letter back into the envelope and slid the folder into the bag the way a woman closes a book she is not yet finished with. There was work to do. There were conversations to be had, not dramatic, but honest. There was, I realized as I turned the lock on the front door, a life still worth protecting. I slept that night with a small, measured confidence that dignity is a thing you decide to hold on to, not something given by others. When I woke in the morning, the world hadn't changed. The name tag from the wedding still existed in my memory, but the way I felt about it had. It did not control me. It guided me. There were many small steps ahead. I would have to choose which ones to take first. I would have to learn how to say no without feeling guilty. I would have to plan how to protect my home and my savings without making my family feel like enemies. And most of all, I would have to find a way to live again that Robert would have liked full, not diminished by the expectations of others. I made a cup of tea, put the folder in a drawer I could reach at night, and picked up my paintbrush. I picked up my paintbrush like someone picking up a telephone after a long silence, tentative at first. Then with a steadier hand. The bristles smelled faintly of turpentine and lemon oil. The studio, where the community class met, smelled of linseed and coffee. The woman who ran the class, a retired art teacher named June, had a laugh that made the room feel like a kitchen, warm and unpretentious. She put paint on my palette and did not ask me why I'd come. She only said, "Join us," and handed me a cup for rinsing. The first strokes were clumsy. My wrist remembered other tasks: knitting, stirring soup, tucking the hem of a dress, and it took a few tries before the brush knew it could make a line that wasn't ashamed of itself. Painting is a slow kind of honesty. You can't hurry color into being. You watch it dry and decide if it's honest enough to live on the canvas. There is comfort in that motion, in the small decisions that add up until a whole surface changes. I began with small studies, a teacup, the old oak tree outside my living room. Then, when I felt less like an intruder in a new life, and more like someone moving into a room, I painted the pond where Robert and I used to sit. The ducks were inelegant, the reflections were clumsy, and when I stepped back, I liked the way the light seemed to lean into the picture the way it used to through our kitchen window. Art didn't fix anything. It didn't straighten the ledger or make the name tag unreadable. But it taught me how to be patient with myself. I started answering calls only at certain hours. I stopped picking up at odd times and letting the ring of the telephone dictate my day. When texts arrived asking for favors, I let them rest unread for a day. If the message was urgent, Michael or Emma would tell me, and if it was not, it remained quiet. There were questions of practicalities, of course. People assume older people keep ashtrays full and calendars empty. I had to decide who could come into the house without an invitation. It felt small and brave to post a polite sign by the doorway. Please call first. Visits by appointment only. I imagined Richard seeing it and smiling condescendingly. Instead, he called once to ask why I needed a sign. And when I said I preferred privacy, his voice tightened and he suggested he only wanted what was best for me. I let the line go still. Little boundary acts were in architecture. I began to cultivate a life that wasn't entirely about other people's expectations. I baked again scones that came out dense but digestible. I watered the geraniums Robert had left on the windowsill and learned how to coax them into bloom. I took a small job at the library twice a week, shelving books. The librarian, a woman named June, another June. Perhaps there are too many good names. Took pity on my slow feet and gave me a stack of cozy mysteries to reshelve so I could sit between shifts and paint. Michael's bookstore became a refuge and a kind of laboratory for my new life. He had a narrow space with large windows and a bell that rang in that old, honest way to announce arrivals. Before I offered him any help, I insisted on seeing his ledger, not out of suspicion but out of habit. He rolled his eyes and produced a notebook with margins full of doodles. He had always been more of a dreamer than a legisman. He wanted to call the store Backstory, a name I had to admit made me smile. I helped him in practical ways, carrying boxes, arranging shelves, pushing a cart of new titles through the early morning. I made tea for the staff and found that, when I read aloud to children on Saturday mornings, something in me unknotted. The voices that used to be threaded with the hush of grief loosened into rhyme and cadence. And then I would say, and a chorus of small hands would clap at the predictable places. One afternoon a woman came by with a commission in her bag, a small framed watercolor of a dog, and the woman paid me with bills that felt real in my palm, but not the heavy kind that used to make me nervous. I went home that night and pinned the receipt to the inside cover of my notebook like a small medal. It meant, to me, less about money and more about the fact that my work had been seen and chosen. Richard and Pamela did not like my new rhythms. When I stopped answering at all hours, they complained. When I said no to another loan request, the complaint turned into hurt. There were strings of texts that arrived like a rain of polite entitlements. "We thought you'd want to help," Pamela wrote once. "We didn't realize you were," and then an ellipsis that felt like a knowing shrug. I stopped explaining. When my silence did not produce the outcome they'd hoped for, they grew loud in other rooms. They began to use other people as spokespeople. "Of course, she loves the boys," Richard would tell anyone who would listen. "She's just being coy." The imputation that I had been forgetful or fractious was a pressure aimed to shame me back into compliance. I found I no longer had patience for the theater of being everyone's safety net. It was 6 months after the wedding when Martin called to ask if I would attend a small family gathering, nothing large. He said it was a birthday celebration for my niece. He mentioned casually that he would be there as well. I felt a pull I couldn't name. I had been avoiding large family events, but the idea of seeing people I had once loved made my heart a little three-legged table, unsteady but willing. When I arrived, they had chosen a modest restaurant with sunlight pooling on the tables. There was a roundness to the room that made voices feel like they could untangle. I sat at the head of the table, not because I was asked, but because my chair had been drawn out for me. Richard sat opposite, and Pamela near him. With an animated smile I had learned to read as calculation, Jennifer sat 2 chairs away. The color in her face was real and life-giving, and that made me soften. Halfway through a lemon tart, Richard cleared his throat and said, with an ease that makes lies taste like lemonade, "We wanted to talk about a practical matter." "Alice, we thought," he glanced at Pamela, who had the look of a woman reciting someone else's script. "We thought it might be time to talk about who will make decisions for you if you need help." A power of attorney can make things simpler. We'd like to discuss names. There is a kind of chill that runs down the spine when the floor seems to tilt under you. I could feel the weight of the table pressing against my knees. I could hear, underneath the clatter of cutlery, the small sound of a pin dropping into a bowl. It was a moment that could have been handled with a gentle conversation about long-term planning. Instead, the words "we'd like to discuss names" sounded like the first sentence of a bill to be signed without my consent. Before I could answer, Martin put his napkin down and reached across. There are people who appear at a table and make it safer simply by being present. He folded his hands and looked at me with a steadiness that felt like the inside of a glove. "There should read," he sighed softly again. I had thought conflict would come like a clap of thunder. It didn't. It came like a small leak that eventually made the ceiling sag. Martin slid a page from his folder and read aloud, clear and steady, the language Robert had asked him to keep. He used one word that made the sound in my mouth, not nearly as sharp as I had expected: cortisol. He explained it in plain terms that Robert had put a condition in the will that would disinherit descendants who publicly humiliated me or made forceful attempts to control my person or property. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded as if he had been given an instruction in a strange language and had done his duty by explaining it. He folded his hands when he had finished and looked at the table. "Mrs. Holley," he said, "I am here to carry out Mr. Hale's wishes, but we have choices. You can decide whether to enforce this clause. You can decide whether you prefer to attempt private reconciliation first, or to ask me to take action." The room made a small, embarrassed noise. Pamela's smile wilted into something thinner. Richard's face, that particular map of bland entitlement and old jokes, grew taut. Jennifer's hand found mine across the table and squeezed. I could feel her warmth. For a moment, I thought I would fold into her the way I used to fold into Robert Small, and exonerated by love. "Do you want me to enforce it?" Martin asked. The question was simple. The answer would change the shape of several lives. I had imagined 100 ways I might react. I had thought about shamming outrage, about making a speech, about writing a letter that would be pasted in place like a warning. I had thought about the joy of seeing them stunned. But the thought I kept returning to was Robert's hand on my wrist, steadying, always wanting to keep our family from being ruined by dividing ironies. He had left me a shield, not necessarily to strike, but to hold. "I do," I said. My voice was not loud. It was clear. There was a moment afterward that felt like a slow film. Richard's face went through shades: first disbelief, then anger, then the exact pale of someone who had had his sword taken. Pamela stood up sharply, gathering napkin and purse with a speed that was almost theatrical. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You can't." Martin used the kind of voice people used in libraries. "The will's language is clear. Mr. Holley left instruction. Executing that instruction is part of my duty." He looked at me, and that the other. "If Mrs. Holley chooses enforcement, I will proceed, as the will requires." Richard laughed then, a dry creature of a laugh, half shrug and half accusation. "You promised us you'd take care of things," he said, as if that were an accusation meant to unseat the whole family history. "You promised." I promised nothing of the sort, I found myself saying. The words surprised me because they were not bitter. They were simply true. Pamela's mouth made that small O again. She turned to Jennifer and said, "We should go." Richard stood, tall and suddenly young in an ugly way, and they left with more clatter than dignity. They did not speak on the way out. The restaurant hummed with the low noise of other people's conversations and the clink of cutlery, as if the world were trying to conserve its privacy. After they left, the table was quieter. Jennifer's eyes were bright as if she'd been crying. She reached across and took my hand. "Grandma," she said, simple as a rope of light. "I didn't know. You didn't have to," I told her. "You did what you thought was right." It was, in many ways, the most adult thing she could have said. She acknowledged the truth without theatrics. She did not ask for absolution from anyone. Later that night, she came by my house and sat on the porch steps. We drank tea and watched the streetlights flood the sidewalk. She told me about small things, about the way the florist cried when she chose the peonies, about how Mark had insisted on writing his own vows and gotten them backwards in the rehearsal. She told me the truth about being young and being hungry for certainty in a world that offers none. She did not defend her father. She only said she was sorry about the way things had happened. Richard and Pamela's estrangement came on like a frost. They sent a brief, formal letter exercise through Martin's office. I've read it more than once. Not because I wanted to, but because people are small sometimes and will always explain their absence as dignity. It said, in legalistic and oddly tidy phrases, that they would no longer seek to be involved in certain decisions. It was less a letter than a closing curtain. Martin did what he had to do. He sent notices. He changed beneficiaries, as the will required. There were conversations with bank managers and with a title office. Files moved. I did not attend most of those transactions because legal documents have a way of making the real thing absent. Like bailing out a leak without looking at the roof. My role was to observe and to be present when decisions needed my signature. Enforcement did not feel like triumph. It felt methodical and necessary. There was an odd, cold satisfaction in seeing a plan that had been thoughtfully made by someone who loved me enacted with professional care, but it also created a void. Families repair in strange ways. Sometimes the breaking is the necessary step toward something not yet visible. For me, the enforcement drew a line that made some people leave. That was true. It also made space for other people to come closer. Michael came closer. Emma moved from occasional visitor to near constant presence at the bookstore, rearranging displays and breathing life into the small space, as if she were humming an old tune back into being. Michael's sister called once. Jennifer called slowly, sometimes haltingly, making small attempts at reconciliation. There were dinners where we ate quietly and spoke of safe things, books, the weather, the taste of summer tomatoes. I used what funds I had left with intention. I helped Michael with the bookstore in ways that were not dramatic. A deposit on a small delivery van. A quiet wire to cover a month's rent when the landlord's notice threatened to kneel the dream. I refused to let anyone call it extravagant or to call me a fool for sustaining a child's dream. There are, after all, different kinds of investments. A bookstore is a small valve in a neighborhood and, for me, a place to find laughter again. My paintings started to sell, not in huge sums. A woman bought a painting of the pond for her son's office. A friend purchased a small still life to hang above her kitchen sink. Each sale felt like a handshake with a stranger who saw something in me and decided it was worth an exchange. I used that modest income to travel once, a short trip, to see my sister in a city 3 hours away and to pay for a new rug I had been too thrifty to buy for years. These were small acts of sovereignty. Claude appeared in my life, like a gentle interruption. He ran a little antiques, stall 2 doors down from Michael's shop. He had the clean hands of someone who repaired things for a living and a laugh, like a small bell. We found ourselves often at the same table when the morning was slow, sharing coffee and the small talk that lives comfortably between two people who have known grief and prefer not to be defined by it. When he asked me once if I wanted to come to a Sunday market with him, I said yes. There was no hurry to it. He liked a particular brand of marmalade that made his eyes crinkle. He told jokes with an economy of words. Romance, in one's later years, is less about fireworks and more about the fiction that someone will notice your favorite mug. Claude noticed. He noticed my tendency to prefer lemon tart over chocolate, my habit of reading aloud to children, my awkward way of painting reflections in water. He volunteered to move a shelf in the bookstore one afternoon and then stayed for tea. We were careful, both of us, to guard against the ancient urge to rush something because it felt good. We let it grow the way geraniums do, patiently, slowly, with attention to water and light. There were, too, moments of sadness. Richard's silence arrived like an ache. There were letters, bitterer now, with the perfume of wounded pride. He accused me, in one of being manipulative, in another of being cold. There were insinuations that Martin had overstepped. Those letters landed on my doormat and sometimes made me tremble. At night, when I walked past the porch light, I would sometimes read them again and remember the laughter that had been there once. It hurt. Hearts do not heal on order. Jennifer's reconciliation came along differently. It came through small steps. She phoned first, fingers fumbling at what to say. Then she visited with a casserole and a candid conversation about fear, about the strange ways young adults feel threatened by the possibility of aging parents. "I was scared I'd lose you," she said one afternoon, and the confession seemed to make us both younger and steadier. She admitted that she'd been seduced by the idea of security and illusion she realized later she had confused with care. She began, slowly, to see me not as an envelope with a name on it, but as a presence with choices, stubbornness, and art. One Saturday she brought along Mark, and together they helped out at a children's reading in the bookstore. The first time I read aloud to them, Jennifer's eyes were bright. She leaned forward as if hearing a favorite song again. Over time, our relationship rebuilt itself not on the currency of money, but on attention. We began, awkwardly at first, to take walks in the park and to discuss small domestic things: what to do with the spoons in the bottom drawer, how to fold a fitted sheet. There were times when a call from her father would arrive, and the house would go quiet. We would watch the red light on the phone and choose when to answer. I didn't want to stand in the way of their family, and they had to learn that their choices had consequences. Jennifer learned, sometimes painfully, that restitution is not always about money. One afternoon she came by with a box of old photographs she had found, and together we made an album. It was a small reconciliation, but meaningful. There were also people who stepped into the spaces made available. Friends I'd lost contact with wrote letters asking how I was, not as an afterthought, but with genuine curiosity. I hosted a small dinner once a month for neighbors and friends where we ate simple food and told true stories. We laughed about the ridiculous habits of dogs and parents. Those dinners reminded me that dignity is often restored by ordinary company. One year after the wedding, Michael's bookstore held a small anniversary celebration. The bell over the door jingled as people drifted in. There were local authors reading short pieces, a table with hot cider, and a cluster of children drawing pictures of dragons. I sat in a chair by the window, my hands folded in my lap, watching a small boy demand that the world provide him with an ending. When Michael asked me to say a few words, I thought of Robert of his way of steadying my wrists when I painted and of the name tag that had once tried to make a joke of me. "I'm Alice," I said, voice steady. "And I suppose that means I'm stubborn, a slow painter, and an appreciator of good marmalade. But I'm also someone who likes libraries, bookstores, and the sound of a bell when people come in. Thank you for making this place live." People cheered, a brief smattering. Jennifer stood near the back, smiling with the tentative joy she had learned to give again. "Richard's name was not mentioned, nor was his absence explained. Some old aches are best left in the tender place, where they can do the work they are meant to do, teach caution, demand reverence, and make new rhythms." By then, the house was arranged to suit me. I had a small studio in the back, room with light, that came in the late afternoon and wrapped itself around the canvases like a shawl. I had a small shelf at the bookstore, where my work hung. I had a routine of painting 3 mornings a week, of making soup on Sundays, of going to the library on Tuesdays. The life was modest but chosen. I learned, over and over again, that dignity is not the absence of being used. It is the ability to refuse to be defined by how others choose to value you. People sometimes ask if I felt bitter after the enforcement of the clause in the will. The honest answer is layered. There was sorrow, of course there was. There's a sorrow in watching a family reconfigure into a shape you did not choose. There was also a sense of justice, quiet as a closed door, that made some days easier to walk through. What's important is this: the clause was never a weapon in my hand to inflict a spectacle. Robert gave me something to guard my dignity, and I used it to do exactly that. The consequence was that some went away and others came near. That is the nature of boundaries. They are fences for both protection and exclusion. In the months that followed, I started teaching a small children's art hour in Michael's store. We had easels and water jars and paper that absorbed mistakes, like good friends absorb sorrows. Children painted dragons and unhelpfully realistic fruits. One little boy painted his house with 5 doors and a smiling sun. His mother later told me that at bedtime he refused to sleep until his painted doors were closed. We sold the paintings for the price of a good lunch and pinned the money to a jar for new supplies. The jar was life, in miniature everything we needed, and none of what we didn't. I sold a painting to the woman who ran the cafe down the street. She took something from the studio and gave me a plate every week, scones with a thin smear of marmalade. Claude and I ate them in the mornings, our hands sometimes colliding over butter. Romance, as I learned, in late life is something you ease into like a warm sweater. It covers you in comfort, without claiming to be all you are. We went to used book fairs and argued gently about whether a 1962 edition of Chekhov deserved a higher place on a shelf. He taught me how to mend a ripped book cover with patience and glue. At night, sometimes, I would wander through Michael's store after closing. I liked the way the lamplight made the spines glow. There is an intimacy in being surrounded by other people's stories. Hiril Hauisu, Juan Carfud Long Carfskamas. My name tag moment, the thing that had started the slow machinery of everything, was no longer a wound but a pivot. I would sometimes take the calligraphy card out of its box and look at the careful letters. There was no pleasurable gloating in seeing the way it had caused change. There was only a sober gratitude that I had chosen dignity and that I had been given a means to protect it. The most surprising thing, perhaps, was the way joy returned as a habit. It came in small increments, a child calling me the painting lady, a friend bringing over strawberries. The bell over the bookstore door ringing to announce someone who needed a book and didn't know it yet. Joy was not the absence of pain. It sat beside the pain, a steady companion who would stay even when grief came to visit. One night in late summer, Jennifer came by with Mark and their small dog. She sat on the sofa and told me, with a confidence that had been hard-won, that she wanted to go through old recipes with me. "Teach me how you folded the pie crust, so it doesn't crack," she said. We spent an afternoon with flour on our hands and the radio playing quietly. That kind of closeness, rebuilt slowly, felt like a small triumph. The last time I wore the name tag to a gathering, it was to show it to Michael's niece as an object lesson in family dynamics. She laughed, then paused, and said quietly, "That's mean." I handed it to her, and she looked at the slanted ink, as if reading a footnote. "It's funny," she said, "how one card can do so much work. We have to be careful with laughter that lands at another's expense. I have been generous, for many reasons, some noble, some sentimental. I will not deny that grief made me softer in ways that were not always good. But softness with boundaries is not a contradiction, it is a practice. The will, the claws, the codicil, these were not about vengeance. They were about preserving a personhood that Robert had loved enough to account for. That fact sat with me like a warm scarf. Now, 1 year since the name tag, and a year older in ways that matter. I stand, sometimes on the threshold of the bookstore, and watch the world go by. Children run past, with sticky fingers. People come in to ask for advice on which novel to give their mother. Michael and Emma move boxes with the quiet choreography of a small company. Claude walks by with a paper bag of bread and smiles. Jennifer drops in with a story about a day at work. I have a routine, and in that routine a kind of dignity. There are mornings when I look at my hands and remember Robert's voice and the heft of a check folded in the back of a recipe box. There are evenings when I read a book on the porch and the light softens everything into an understanding. I do not pretend that all wounds are healed. Richard and Pamela remain in a silence that is theirs, but silence can be a teacher too. It shows you who arrives when you stop playing the role people expect you to play. I have learned to refuse jokes that sting. I have learned to be kind without being an ATM. I have learned to say no without feeling I am unforgiving. And perhaps most of all, I have learned that late life is not a winding down but a choosing. The choices I make now are mine, small, deliberate, sometimes messy, but honest. If you come into the store on a Saturday morning, you might find me in a corner by the window, painting small studies of the street. You might see a card of my work pinned to the shelf. You might hear me read aloud to a group of children, mispronouncing a fancy word and laughing as they correct me. You might see Claude across the street, waving a bread bag like a banner. You might see Michael close the shop with a satisfied glance. You might notice, as I once noticed, that the sun has a way of finding a person who has made a life worth tending. So, if you take anything from my story, let it be this: dignity is not a thing people grant you. It is a thing you decide to keep. Sometimes keeping it means drawing a line. And sometimes it means inviting someone in for tea and listening as they stumble toward making amends. There is no single script for this. There is only the particular shape of your life. Before I go, one small request. If my story has touched you, leave a comment telling me the city you're watching from and maybe a memory about a time you found your name tag in a family crowd. If you liked listening, please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who might need to hear it. Tell us below half your own name. What did you do?